Professor Dr. Peter Baofu, I'm very delighted to welcome here to our studio, the national broadcaster here in Tonga. So based on what you do, there are many issues here in Tonga that raises a lot of concerns in the national agenda. So what would you propose that Tonga should do to tackle the issue on climate change and illicit drugs, which is a major concern for us here in Tonga?
Okay, those are the two issues which, by the way, also happen in some of the local, your neighbors. Fiji, for example, Malia also have some of the same problems.
And climate change as well?
Climate change is also another major issue here in the Pacific Islands, but that's also affecting the entire planet Earth too, not just in Tonga. And also in the Pacific Islands too, you have a lot of things in common. There are also a lot of solutions too. For example, let me give you some example. When I was in Vanuatu, I visited some farmers, and they told me some of the problem about climate change. I asked them, how does it affect your production? They say, well, some of the crops that we used to produce, we cannot produce them anymore because it's getting too hot, and we don't have sufficient water, drought and all that. And the temperature is very high. It's very hot. So I said, what do you do? They said, well, we are switching now. We do not produce those crops anymore. Now we switch to produce other crops. They are much more resistant to heat. In fact, now we can even harvest them all season long because it's hotter now. They grow very fast. So it's good for us. Now we can plant them several times throughout the years on different lands, of course. So throughout the year, we can always harvest. In fact, it's more profitable for us now. We can sell more now. Okay, there's one solution. So is to how do you adapt with climate change? Climate change by itself is not necessarily bad. It's just how you adapt to that. If you adapt to that successfully, you will be okay, you will survive. But if you don't, you will become extinct, just like in evolution. Another solution is biotechnology. In the US, for example, we also have the same problem, but now what did they do? They introduced biotechnology through genetic engineering or some other thing. Now they create some plants, some animals which are much more drought resistant, heat resistant. So the plants, the crops, instead of dying out quickly because of the high temperature, they become much more resistant to drought and high temperature. We use biotechnology. We change the genetic makeup of the plants and the crops and the animals. And we breed them. So over time, those are different crops. We change them genetically with biotechnology. And then we harvest them. Now they are much more resistant to climate change. Okay, we're still in the beginning of doing that. Another solution. The third one is that many of the local economies, including Tonga, is depending too much on agriculture and tourism. It's not sustainable in the longer term. You need to move out of agriculture and tourism. You need to do something else. And also, many of the countries over here, also they're sending a lot of laborers to New Zealand, Australia, the US, and so on to work. I think that your economy, if you continue to depend on tourism, agriculture, and immigration, you will lose in the long term. It's not sustainable. You need to find out an economy which is much more productive. You go into other sectors of the economy, manufacturing, service sector, for example, education, science, innovation, and all that. So I say all the most powerful, most advanced countries on earth, they are not dependent on agriculture. They do not depend on tourism. They do not depend on immigration. On the contrary, they do something else. So you need to move out of those sectors. That's the third solution. The fourth solution is that I think that some of the local countries over here, Tonga, Fiji, Tuvalu, Micronesia, Marshall Islands, Solomon Islands, Nauru, Palau, and all those countries, I think they need to work together as a group because you are too small. Think about it. In Tonga, the population is only about 100,000. In Tuvalu, there's only about 10,000 people. My university, MIT, has more student population than the entire population in Tuvalu. you are too small. Climate change is a global problem. You cannot address climate change problem by working by yourself because you are too tiny, too small. You don't have sufficient capital to deal with that problem. You need to cooperate together. This, the Pacific Islands Forum is a good example, but you need to work more on that. Right now, they are not unified. Right now, they are divisive. Each person is saying something else, and some of them are not work together. Australia, as you know, just I think last year bought some nuclear submarines from the U.S., but it's a violation of the Pacific Island Creed that we should be nuclear free. You see that different countries are not working together. They pursue their own interests at the expense of the rest of the group. So I do think that, and plus you are dependent on outside powers, Australia, New Zealand, and the U.S. That is also not good for you. You have to look into yourself. I think that the Pacific Island, the more small countries should unify together, not in a nation state, but like as a group, work more closely together, cooperate with each other to deal with the problem of climate change collectively, not individually. So you ask me, how do you cope with that? I think there are a lot of different solutions. In fact, I gave you some 4 solutions already. Maybe another problem that I see, which is very common in the Pacific Islands, is land ownership in this culture. That kind of system has been there for hundreds of years. It's very bad in many ways for economic development because you are impoverishing yourself. The land system in the Pacific Islands, the same thing in many other local countries, is that the land cannot be sold. The land is inherent from one generation to the next. And in Samoa, for example, many of the lands in the front, you will see a graveyard. Their father, the mother, the grandfather, whoever, when they die, they bury them in their home. I mean, outside them. So that is an indication that this land is mine, belong to my family. They are not sold. Now, that is very bad for agricultural development, for example, because you will see that many of the most successful agricultural practices are often dependent on farmers. They can invest, they can expand, they can grow. But when you have a system like that, the land is divided into so many different families and they cannot be sold or anything. And you can list them, fine, but many farmers are very reluctant to expand the business if they know that this land is not theirs. In fact, they can be canceled anytime. They cannot plan long term. Okay, and once the land is not yours, and you cannot plan long term because the lease can be adjusted anytime, and you know that if something happens, you will lose all of this investment. So it's very bad for agricultural development. This kind of system, I know that it is part of the local culture. I'm just saying that maybe it's also time to think about your local culture, is that some of the practices are counterproductive for development. Again, it's up to you to decide because that's your way of life. So no one can tell you what to do. I can only tell you that if you pick one thing, they have consequences. The consequences will be some of the trade-offs. I want to show you how do you choose. It's up to you. But my job is to tell you the trade-off. Just like I told you about the laid-back culture. There's also your way of life. Fine, but I tell you now, there are consequences. The consequences is not just obesity, which is about the health problem, but also about economic development because you don't want to work too much. Okay, so this is and the family system like this over here is good for the family, but it's not good for individual development. So it's that each of them has a trade-off. Now, which one do you choose, or how much is the trade-off that you want to choose? What is the combination? Now that you have to decide. I only give you the solution and the analysis, and then how do you going to pick them? I think that's up to you.
Thank you so much. Those are very, very interesting proposals and solutions that Tonga needs to look into. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Yes.